There we go, one more time. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many of you here at the first Father Cleary Memorial Lecture. We're so happy to host this event, and to get us started, I'd like to introduce Provost Hugh Lena to offer words of welcome.
Thank you, Jeffrey. On behalf of Father Shanley, who's away from campus right now, I welcome you to this event. It's great to see this attendance, and a special invite to our distinguished guest. It's also an honor for me to be able to bring you welcome for this event, the Ed Cleary Memorial Lecture Series. Ed was a good friend. He came to Providence College in 1993 as a professor of Latin American Studies, was subsequently assigned to the political science department, went through the tenure process, and was always a good friend to me because we were sociologists by training, so we could talk about our common interests and work. And what was special for me personally was that he constantly asked me how my daughter, who was also going through graduate work in sociology, was doing, always kept in touch with me about her, and that was special. But he was a special person. I thought I would leave you with this thought. Ed was really committed to the work on human rights in Latin American Church and was an incredibly productive person. I think I can say with some assurance that he's the only faculty member who I ever approved for a sabbatical who claimed he would write 2 books during the sabbatical and actually completed that project. He was a remarkable person. He also was invited to a lot of conversations internationally where he was in the midst of distinguished people and would bring back to the campus his thoughts about those experiences. But I also think Ed was special as a research professor of political science and Latin American studies because he had the interests of students at heart. He was deeply committed to the Latin American studies program, hung on to it tightly as we talked about creating a global studies program, and so I think it's important to recognize the special affection that he had for students. And speaking of which, it's my honor to introduce Ethan Gentes, who will introduce our principal speaker. So welcome and thanks.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to learn more about Latin America. It is a great honor to speak at the first ever Father Cleary Memorial Lecture, and I would like to take a moment to tell you about the impact Father Cleary had on me personally and on all of his students. I first came into contact with Father Cleary before I made the decision to come to PC. I heard about him from Danny Richer, my admissions interviewer. I was only a senior in high school with an interest in Argentine history, but Father Cleary kept up an email conversation with me and even sent me hard copies of his favorite books on Argentine politics. Coming to PC was one of the best decisions of my life, in part because there are such incredible resources for students who want to study Latin America, and Father Cleary became a personal and academic mentor for me. He invited me to his senior seminar classes and taught me priceless lessons about politics, religion, and culture that not only enriched my study abroad experience in Buenos Aires, but gave me perspective on the Latino community here in the US. I recently finished a thesis on Argentine labor history, and my main argument, analyzing how lack of accountability in government and economic disparities led to violence in one specific case in the 1920s, comes straight from Father Cleary's teachings about the importance of social justice and the ability of normal, downtrodden people to make immense political change. Today we welcome President Lagos to share his experience fighting for social justice at the forefront of the movement that returned Chile to democracy in the late 1980s. President Lagos helped the Chilean people to say no to a military dictator, and over the course of the return to democracy, we can see the courage and resolve that Father Cleary always attributed to the poor and the oppressed of Latin America. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the Political Science Department, Latin American Studies. I guess that would be a lot of folks there. The Pi Sigma Alpha Interdisciplinary Faculty Seminar on Justice, Public Administration, Pi Sigma Alpha, History Department, Global Studies, Organization of Latin American Students, and Modern Languages, as well as American Studies. Thank you to all of you for supporting this event to remember Father Cleary and welcoming President Lagos. President Lagos was one of the key figures in the movement opposing the rule to the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile, and later became the first socialist president since Salvador Allende to be elected for the Republic of Chile. And under his administration, an independent investigation of the Pinochet-era torture, killings, and human rights violations compiled in the Valich Report, which President Lagos is going to leave a copy here for our own library, which we're very grateful to him for, led to a much more meaningful process of transitional justice and accountability than had occurred previously. As Father Cleary said in one of his books, he wrote it in his book, Mobilizing for Human Rights in Latin America, the response of the traumatic shock of the 1973 bloody overthrow supported by the United States of a democratically elected president by Chile's Augusto Pinochet was far-reaching. Latin America became a movement society, one in which movements concerned about various issues appeared, many of them focused on human rights. These movements, generally speaking, were aimed at improving the shape of the world in which Latin Americans lived. This was a major shift away from passivity and fatalism toward empowerment or agency. Previous attitudes of dependency were related to government and or to ruling elites. They became transformed to a more self-reliant outlook. This transformation was a sea change. Organizing in overseas countries in order to do something about the injustices in Chile soon extended itself to other Latin American countries, as these also fell under repressive rule. The human rights era of Latin America had begun. And then in 2004, the movement against torture, many Chileans were fixed on their television sets as President Lagos received this highly publicized Valich report from a Blue Ribbon Commission headed by Catholic Bishop Sergio Valich of happy memory, to be considered, to a considerable extent, Lagos shocked the nation by revealing that some 33,000 of a population of 11 million, and I figured out the proportionality of that. If we had 950,000 people of the United States tortured, it would be proportionally the same. That would be quite shocking, I think, to anyone in this room. Chileans testified before the commission as how they had been tortured or severely ill-treated by the Chilean police or military. Lagos went on to describe the horrific manner in which torture was conducted. He also emphasized that some of these tortured were children. After the Valich report revelations, Chileans spent weeks psychologically processing what they had been told. Chileans torturing Chileans. This was barbarous. Chile is a democracy, and this should never happen again. Many viewers reported the strong effect the report had on them. The human rights movement in Latin America contributed to a turn in democracy while under military and authoritarian rule. Democracy was forthcoming in part because attention to human rights created a strong impetus for citizen participation and rule of law, major components of democracy. President Lagos, thank you for honoring us with your presence for this lecture, honoring a beloved scholar, a colleague, and a dear friend, who cared deeply about human rights, loved Latin America, and I traveled with him twice to Chile. He loved Chile.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your introduction. And let me first of all tell you that I'm extremely happy to be here, an honor to be here, and to participate in this that is the first Father Edward or Harry Memorial Lecture. Father Cleary was one of those best examples of the compromise of a father, of a priest, with human rights and human values. At the very end, how is the compromise that you have with a human being, and to respect human being in the dignity that each of them has. When I was young, like those here studying in Providence College, I never thought that during my lifetime I was going to be living under a dictatorship in my own country. We were and we are a faraway country down the south, possible to distinguish by this very long, 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 long country. People used to say that the only way to build a soccer field is north to south because it doesn't fit, but this is not true. It's possible to have a soccer field east to west. But other than that, once that dictatorship came upon Chile, it was a different Chile of the one that I was used to. And I have been invited here to talk about human rights, transitional justice, and democratization of Chile. And it's true. The question of human rights is something like the air. You take for granted that human rights has to be respected, that the institution of habeas corpus existed over more than 10 centuries ago. And only when the air is polluted, only when the air is not clean, then you realize what you have lost. And I belong to that generation of Chileans that used to take for granted that human rights in Chile should be respected. Therefore, the question is, and we learned the hard way, that whenever a human right of some male or female in any part of the world is being violated, then it's necessary for all of us to stand up and protest. It's true. During those dark days in Chile, the discussion was the discussion that you have in any dictatorship. How are you going to fight in order to recover a democratic system? What are you going to do? If it is possible to have some kind of pacific protest and the inspiration of somebody like Gandhi or Mandela immediately came to our mind, or as some other people used to say, the only way to defeat a military dictatorship is through military means. But be careful. If you go through military means, what are you going to have afterwards? Once that you defeat them, another military rule in the country? In other words, if we are going to keep talking now about transitional experience, the transition has a lot to do with the kind of road that you follow in order to defeat the dictator. And let me tell you that after 10 years of Pinochet in power, social protest emerged in Chile, and that was probably the first indicator that Chileans were trying to recover the soul of Chile. And then the discussion was, what kind of protest, what kind of social protest are you going to have? And then the big issue came when, in spite of the social protest, and we keep saying and demanding the resignation of Pinochet, that never happened. And those that thought that was possible, some kind of military answer to Pinochet, I would say that didn't succeed because weapons going down to Chile were discovered by Pinochet. And after that, those that were willing to attempt against Pinochet, attempt against Pinochet's life, and they failed. 5 bodyguards of Pinochet were killed, but not Pinochet himself. And needless to say what happened afterwards. Therefore, since this attempt against Pinochet was in 1986, all of us has the feeling that 1986 was going to be a decisive year. I gave an interview to Newsweek and I say 1986 is going to be a decisive year. And then was the attempt against Pinochet, and I was taken to prison because they say, well, this guy probably knows something about that. No, we say that was a decisive year because according to Pinochet's constitution, the first legal period of Pinochet was 8 years, beginning in 1980. And after 8 years, a plebiscite was going to take place, and Chileans will have to say yes or no to another 8 years of Pinochet. Therefore, we have the sense that after 86, one that we were in 1987, what we have is, for the first time, a road that Pinochet has to walk on in order to remain in power, which was to win the plebiscite. And we thought that the country with the democratic traditions of Chile, it was possible to organize the Chilean people in order to defeat him in the road that was supposed to allow them another 8 years. And the plebiscite was yes or no. Yes, you want that Pinochet will follow. No, you want that Pinochet is finished. And that was it. Therefore, the fact that the kind of transition that we have was a transition established according to the rules established by Pinochet's constitution. And this was a tremendous fight among ourselves, the different leaders. Are we going to accept Pinochet's constitution, yes or no? And the question was, this is not a question of accepting yes or no. It has the power to impose ourselves the constitution. Let us use the constitution to defeat him. And this is what we did at the end. And this means to organize a country. All of you will remember 1986, President Marcos in Philippines was being defeated. In some other places, something similar. I remember that I came to the United States and many people told me that we need to organize people in polling stations, and we say that we're going to do that. They say that it's necessary to have only 1/3 of polling stations, and we say we're going to have all polling stations covered by us, and we did. In short, Chileans were able to organize, and we defeat Pinochet. We defeat Pinochet in a plebiscite. I used to say we defeat Pinochet with a pencil and a paper. But it's not correct because to reach that moment, the yes or no in the plebiscite was a huge social movement. And in that huge social movement, I would like to say here, the Catholic Church and some other religious institutions play in Chile a very important role. The cardinal in the first place. And therefore, here you have an influence, extremely important. But this influence allows us to defeat, but according to Pinochet's constitution, Pinochet will extend automatically the mandate for 1 additional year. And after that, we will have 3 presidential elections, and we agree in one candidate, and President Elwin was inaugurated in March of 1990. And that was the beginning of this very peculiar transition. With Pinochet's constitution, and more peculiar, with Pinochet as commander-in-chief of the army during 8 years. Why I say this? Because it's so easy to think today what kind of transition I would like to have. But this is 2013. And we have to run a country in a constitution that established that Pinochet will remain in power as commander-in-chief during 8 years. Number 2, it's true. how are we going to be dealing with the atrocities committed under Pinochet? And President Elwin was the first one to appoint a presidential commission in order to investigate what happened with those Chileans that have been executed, about 1,000, and those Chileans that has disappeared. Almost 3,000. And that presidential commission established the way that most of those Chileans disappeared, what was behind those that had been executed. And when President Elwin went to television to explain the report, he asked pardon on behalf of the Chilean state for what Chilean state had committed that was terrorism, but by the Chilean state. It was a very moving moment. What was the answer? The military said that the presidential commission was not telling the whole truth. And many people that supported Pinochet didn't accept that report. There was a second problem. What about those thousands and thousands and thousands of Chileans that were living on exile, that has been expelled from the country? Well, the government decided to send some special legislation in order to attempt to bring them back to Chile and to give some help in order to help them to reestablish in Chile. There was a third category of those Chileans that used to work in the public sector, in the federal government, would you say, or in the state or municipal government, or Chileans that used to work in firms that are public firms owned by the government, by the state, or by the city council, and has been expelled simply because of political considerations. And then the question was, what are we going to do in order to allow them either to have a pension because they are so old they have to retire, or whatever it is. I was elected president in the year 2000, 10 years after the first president after Pinochet. Pinochet at that time was not anymore commander-in-chief. According to Pinochet's constitution, he was supposed to be senator for life. But as you all know, probably Pinochet was taken by Judge Garzón from Spain and was detained in London. And he remained for more than 1 year in London. And he returned to Chile a few days before my inauguration. And then another step followed. And this is something that I fight extremely in order to make possible. I said the judiciary in Chile should be an independent body. And the judiciary is the one to judge Pinochet. And my duty as a president is to make sure that the judiciary is independent from pressure, in any sense. It's not for the president in a democratic system to interfere. And I remember that one of those people that I met when I was in Yale, a former general, went to see me if I can do anything for Pinochet being persecuted. And I say I cannot do anything. I say this because this is part of the transition. But then there was in the government a discussion, what about political torture? And there was a very interesting discussion, political discussion. Till what extent, do you know of any other report about political torture? Aren't you afraid that if you make a discussion about political torture, this is going to produce a polarization in the country? It has been already 10 years of a new system. Pinochet is having some problem. Why don't we rest? On the other hand, there was a lot of organization of the thousands of Chileans that have suffered political prison and political torture, and they demand also that something has to be done from the point of view of the Chilean society. If they wanted to work, and the papers were not clean because they have been in prison. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that here, the question of dealing with political prisoners and torture was a difficult one. Nevertheless, I thought that was the only way was to answer to this. And at the end, I say, okay, I'm going to establish a presidential commission at the highest level, and that presidential commission will make a report on political prisoners and torture. To organize and to define was not an easy task. Why? First, because till what extent, how difficult is going to be to make sure that that person has been a political prisoner and has not been in prison because of some crimes. Fortunately, tribunals during all the dictatorship of Pinochet received the diligence of habeas corpus when somebody were taken to prison. And most of them, you never knew where was that prison. Therefore, at least you knew the date of that he was taken away because there was an habeas corpus presented to a tribunal, never succeeded the habeas corpus, but at least there was a signature. Number two, this is going to establish the truth of what happened, but it's not going to make a judgment because the judgment is for the tribunals. To make the truth, it was necessary to take a statement for everybody that has been in prison and presented what happened to them. It was necessary to form more than 2,000 Chileans to teach them how are you going to receive the statement, to explain that you are going to receive the statement on behalf of the Chilean society and on behalf of the Chilean state, and to explain them that the statement is going to be private during the next 30 years. Why private? Because many people doesn't like to tell what kind of torture and what happened during torture. It's some sort of degrading for the human being to say, or the woman to say, I was raped several times. And therefore, you want to tell what happened to you, what kind of torture. Well, this report, rather thick. In this report, all the centers where the political prisoners remain has been classified according to the kind of torture that in that particular center of detention were practiced. This report is like Dante Alighieri explaining how is Inferno. But at the same time of this report also is a way by which Chilean society, to each of them that make the statement, ask pardon on behalf of the Chilean society. After saying this, if those that make the statement wanted to have justice, not the truth in the report will say that Mr. So-and-so was in prison because of political motivation. That's it. But if you want justice, then the same thing that a statement that you made to the commission, then go to a judge and make the same statement to the judge. And he is the one, because he is a judge, that can make the investigation and can make the report and can try to find who has to be accused. Because of many of those judges and the tribunals and decisions, Not many countries can tell, probably, that the chief of the secret police of Pinochet has been in prison during the last 10 years. And he will have to remain in prison for the next 400 years, a little bit more than that. Why 400? Because you are adding the different crimes that he has been accused, and in Chile, among others, thanks to the church that helped me, during my administration, the death penalty was abrogated. Let me tell you, for any politician, it's not easy to do that. Because whenever there is a crime, the sense of a society is to say death penalty. But I don't think that we human beings can take the life from some other human being. But this is a very personal thing. The question is that is possible, and in that commission, the head of that commission was, as you mentioned, Monsignor Balish. Monsignor Balish, during many, many years, was the head of the Vicariate of Solidarity. Whenever you were subject of detention, you went to this vicariate, they will put you a lawyer and start the question. And he has a tremendous moral integrity. And members of the different political positions of Chile, members of the human rights, members of the church institutions participate in that report. And at the end, the report was a very peculiar thing. I have to explain to the Chilean people the report in the way that was expressing what you read before. And it's true. I say, when I appointed the commission, I say that there is no tomorrow without yesterday. We cannot assume that nothing happened, since all of us know of what happened. And once that the report was published, I say, in order not to happen again, those practices, never deny them again, because existed. And it seems to me that because of that, well, things had already changed in Chile. That report, the armed forces accepted and asked pardon for that. 10 years later, it's a long time with regard to the first presidential report of President Elwin in 92, when they rejected that. So the context is so important, you see. During those 10 years, Chilean society has matured, many people has matured, many people learned it's not possible to keep denying what existed, and let us face truth as it is. And this, I think, is important. And at the same time, I think that it's so important to have some sort of leadership and clarity of why are you doing this? Not because you want vengeance, not because you want to take an account of what happened, but simply because in order to be able to look ahead, we should be, and we need to have courage enough to see how it was possible that in our own society, Chileans torture another Chileans. But this is what happened. And therefore, the big issue is, and our learning lesson is, I never thought that this was going to be possible in my country, but this is what happened, and we will have to be able to face it. After saying this, I will say that it's true. In our government coalition, there was a coalition for different political parties, from the center, center-right to the center, center-left. It was a very broad coalition of democratic forces that we fight against Pinochet. And we thought that after 4 or 5 years, then politics is going to be back to normal. And different political parties will stand competing for power. But given the challenges that we discover that to go from a country that was rather backward, and we want to modernize the country, and we want to democratize and give, to have a democracy that deliver those things that citizens are asking, then probably it's going to be much more difficult, the transition post-dictatorship, in order to build a better country. In 1990, 40% of the Chilean people were living under the poverty line. Very obviously, that poverty was the #1 issue in the social agenda. 20 years later, that has been reduced to 13%, 11%. Tremendous success. Yes, it's true. But even though it's true that poverty has been reduced, democracy is a process. Democracy is a dynamic concept. You demand to democracy more today because you are living in a richer country than what you demand to democracy yesterday when you were living in a poorer country. In short, citizens demand some kind of provisions of public goods or services they think are essential. And therefore, the big issue in any democratic country is how are you going to be able to put the equilibrium between the demands of the citizens and the possibilities of that society of fulfilling the demands of the citizens. It's not an easy task, I know. But let me tell you that I do think that this is essential. We have had some advances. In today's Chile, it's true, we have been able now to have, at college or university level, of 10 students, 7 first generation in their family. 7 first generation in their families. Not bad, an accomplishment for 24 years. But you have to pay for that education. And not everybody can pay for that education. And that is what explains why you have so many social protests among students in Chile during these days. And therefore, the way that you have organized the educational system is an educational system that doesn't have the agreement of the majority of our population. And this is probably the major problem that now we have. In other words, when you say, why don't you talk a little bit about democratization of Chile? What I would like to tell you is that because we have been able to succeed in the transition, because we have been able to change a little bit the country, because when you have a per capita income of $5,000 per person in Chile in 1990, now you have a per capita income of $15,000. You multiply by 3 per capita income during those 20 years. Needless to say, there is now those people that leave poverty behind, an emerging middle class that demands more, and therefore the problem today in today's Chile is not poverty. Of course, still to have a 13% or 14% of people living under the poverty line is a huge task to accomplish. But what about the other 20-something that leave poverty behind and now has a different kind of demands? And how you make sure then that the growth of the country means that it's transformed because you have a better school or a better primary health care center or a better hospital or a better road or a better infrastructure or a better social building, social housing. And this is something that you have to be able to balance. And this is what you have to demand. Bobbio, the political philosopher, the Italian political philosopher, has a beautiful sentence. He says that every society has to define what he called minimum civilizatorio. And I like the expression minimum civilizatorio. And he said, what is minimum civilizatorio? It's the minimum by which every society defines that this is the minimum, that with regard to that minimum, all of us has to be equal. All of us has to be equal in that minimum. Needless to say, that minimum is dynamic, it's not static, and it's growing when the country is growing. And who define that? The citizens. Through the people that they elect to be the president, to be the members of the cabinet that the president will appoint, or the members of Congress, or whatever. In other words, it's a very personal definition. That is the adding of all the society that is going to produce at the end what kind of democratization will you have. I was very proud as a president opening a new hospital. Blue ribbon that you cut, you know, and all those things. Some nice speech, I hope. And at the end of the ceremony, somebody in the public approached me and said to me, Mr. President, I want to talk with you. Mr. President, I have something to tell you, very important. So at the end I say, okay, allow them to come here. Mr. President, what kind of hospital have you built here? Why? Look, the beautiful building. And say, yes, but I'm sure that you have no idea. This hospital, this new hospital, has no scanner. Has no scanner. When you are president, somebody is behind you. So I say, Minister, what can you answer to that? And the minister told me, the Minister of Health told me and say, what happened, Mr. President, that in the next town, 40 miles from here, the hospital we have in that town has a scanner. And given the amount of population in this city, well, it's not necessary for the time being to have a scanner. So they will have to go 40 kilometers. And I say, well, you see, that's the answer. And the gentleman say, excuse me, Mr. President, I want a scanner in my town, in my hospital. For him, the minimum civilizatorio means to have a scanner in the hospital. You see the point? You see the point? And how you make these decisions. And when you say, look, at the very end, a democracy is in good shape when it's able to deliver what the majority of the people is asking. If you are unable to deliver, better you explain that. In many cases, you have to explain why you're going to be unable to deliver, what they are asking. But how are you going to be able to have this talk? And at the very end, that is democracy. In short, I would say that democracy and the process of democratization never ends. It's true. At the time of the military, at the time of Pinochet still commander-in-chief, every Chilean knew the names of the commanders-in-chief. It was part of the landscape of Chilean politics. Who are the commanders-in-chief? The other day I was discussing a presentation about a book. It was about 500 people. And I asked, can you please tell me, what's the name of the commander-in-chief of the Air Force? Nobody knew that. That was not so 10 years ago. And I'm sure that if I ask you, who is the commander-in-chief of the Air Force in this country, not many of you will know that. That means that the militaries are doing what they are supposed to be, part of the institution of a country, but they have the monopoly of the weapons. But because they have the monopoly of the weapons, the when and how are you going to use those weapons, that depends of those civilian people that has been elected to make the decision on behalf of that country. That's real democratic system. You are professional using the weapons. You have the monopoly, of course, but it's those that have been elected, those that are in position to make the when and how are you going to use it. In short, I think that we have been able to do something and to advance a little. And I would say that probably this lecture, as a tribute to Father Cleary, well, it's something I can end up telling to you, is that it's only through democratic values that at the very end, the human dignity is preserved. Politics is not a very nice word these days. I know that politics is not very prestigious profession, if you can say that that is a profession. But yes, what I do think is important is that politics at the very end is how a society is going to be able to have a human being being protected by that society in his or her dignity. And this is at the very end what democracy is about. And this is at the very end why we need democracy, in order that the definition that we are going to make are the definition made by citizens, all of us members of this society. And in the case of Chile, I guess, the big challenge today is to understand that now it's a different country. It's a different context. We have different challenges. Every generation has its own epic. My generation's epic was to defeat Pinochet. The new generation that are on the streets of Chile today, the epic is to build a more humane and a better society. And this is a never-ending task. But all of us has to be and has to accept the challenge of the task that we have in our time. And this is why I think it's so important then to understand that the beginning of everything is to learn to respect human rights. And this is why this memorial lecture is so important, to honor somebody that was able to fight for those values, the values of mankind and human beings. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. With President Lagos's indulgence, I'm going to open it up for questions. So I'd like for our two Pi Sigma Alpha members to come to the mics. And so if there are any questions from the audience, you can raise your hand and the mics will come to you. See one over here.
Hi, Presidente Lagos. Thank you for speaking to us. I was hoping you could talk about the plebiscite. It seems to me in the story of the overthrow of Pinochet, the really key point was Pinochet agreeing to the plebiscite. What were the pressure points that finally forced him to make that agreement? Were there international, was there international pressure involved, or was it really strictly a homegrown movement from the Chilean people?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that there is no question about the intervention from foreign powers with regard to the military coup. In this country, the Congress has expressed very clearly what happened during that period. Now, let me tell you that during the Reagan's second administration, there was a change from the point of view, I would say, of the U.S. policy toward Chile and in general towards some other dictatorship at that time in Latin America. And the idea was to bet more for democracy, upon democratic institutions rather than dictators. The idea of the national security or things like that were over. And it seems to me then that at the time of the plebiscite in Chile, I can tell this to you, while I was in prison, I get acquainted with a captain of the police. And that captain became a major or something like that. And 3 days before the plebiscite, he told me about a few things that may happen during the night of the plebiscite. We were able in a position to learn about that with that tip. We informed foreign countries, and foreign countries took some steps in order to make sure that this is not going to happen. In other words, there was an involvement, and very important, the international community that went down to Chile to be there for the plebiscite and to see that the plebiscite was going to be correct and no fraud. And this, I think, was very important. When you go to a small town in Chile and say, look here, some international observer is going to be here for the plebiscite. But do you really think that somebody is going to be here for the plebiscite? Yes, somebody is going to be here. More than 2,000 foreign observers went down to Chile. More than 2,000. Now, for those observers, all of them wanted to be where the action was. That was the capital, Santiago. And to tell them you had to go so many thousands of miles from Santiago to a small town was not the most, the most brilliant idea. But all of them understood and all of them accepted what we did. So there was an international pressure looking to what's going to happen in Chile. There was an attempt, some people would say probably not, to accept the result of the plebiscite. But at the very end, I would say that the international community played an important role in order to fight in favor of those Chileans that wanted to have an open and clean plebiscite. Yeah. There is a picture, you know, the no, a film about the no in the plebiscite. And I would say it reflects the last 30 days and what happened because for the plebiscite, the yes has 15 minutes on national TV and the no another 15 minutes. Of course, if you are living during 17 years on a dictatorship, the 15 minutes of the yes was the news that they used to see during the last 17 years. There was nothing new there. But the 15 minutes of the no was a tremendous, powerful instrument, you know. But I wouldn't say that we won because of the video that we presented on TV. No, we won because of the mobilization of the Chilean people. Yeah.
Thank you for coming to Providence College. This is a general question about democracy in other nations. I'm curious as to your thoughts about a country perhaps like China. I spent a year teaching there, and during my time there, at the end of the year, I was actually interrogated by the secret police, and so, you know, experienced a little bit of political oppression. So I believe in human rights, for sure. It was a very, you know, as a US American citizen, it was a very interesting experience. At the same time, being of Chinese descent and knowing culturally of that place a little bit, I mean, I grew up in a nice Jewish neighborhood, so I don't speak a word of Chinese, but I just wonder what you thought, you know, how does democracy play out in these other nations, other cultural contexts? At the same time, human rights is, of course, is very important.
Well, I guess it's difficult to generalize on this issue, no? In Latin America, at least, I guess, we have been successful to get rid of most of the dictators. And I think that we have been successful now in having elections every year and every few years, etc., etc. Nevertheless, it's difficult in some other civilizations to understand the dignity of the human being should be one. And this is what we have learned, during the 20th century. And therefore, shouldn't have different definitions. But I can understand that some other societies, probably the sense of hierarchy, the sense of order, the sense of maybe a little bit different. But I think that now, at least in most countries, the question is, can you have a very open economy and a very centralized political power? And the questions about the Chinese or the questions about some other countries, Singapore is a good example. It's a very small state, extremely centralized and that very open from the point of view of the economic elements of that economic system. But in the long run, I think that after what happened in the fall of the Berlin Wall, nobody can predict what's going to happen. At the end was an implosion from within. There was no external forces there. It's simply that the lack of freedom at the very end is what produced that effect. Now, needless to say that when the country is growing, when you are starving, you don't have time to think about democracy. The only thing that you can think about is how you're going to eat tonight. But when that you are better off, then you keep thinking. And then the problem is what's going to happen then, Now, it's true, when you have 1.3 billion people, well, it's a tremendous challenge, And therefore, things are a little bit different. But in short, I would say, in the long run, I think that it's very difficult to have an improvement in the standard of living, that middle class emerging, more empowered through Twitter, through internet. I wish we had a Twitter, when we were fighting with Pinochet. Oh my goodness. I remember it was forbidden at that time to publish what we say in the journals because it was a state of siege. And approached me a journalist and say, Mr. Lagos, this is for the New York Times. What can you say? And say, excuse me, I don't care about the New York Times. I wanted to have a Chilean Times, very little to publish something, but because I know how important is the New York Times, of course, but my problem was to address to the Chilean people. So it's this new. By the way, I think I would conclude with this. I think that still have not appeared the political institution that will emerge because of the new technologies of communication. If you think at the very end, because Gutenberg, think about the press, and 200 years later, after Gutenberg, somebody in London decided to have the Times of London, and because the Times of London was a newspaper that prints news that fit to be printed according to the New York Times, well, then some philosophers in France thought that was possible to have a democratic system. Because if all of us are able to read, and what we read the different public choices that has. Why those choices are going to be made by the king and those around the king and not by all of us, that because we know how to read and write, we can have our own ideas. Till what extent democracy, as we understand today, is the outcome of Mr. Gutenberg and the press. But it took more than 400 years since Gutenberg and to have a democratic system, and the French Revolution. Now, things today happen very quick. And therefore, what's going to happen with this new instrument? And it seems to me that still remains to be seen what institution will emerge that will make our democratic system much more democratic and according to the new instrument, technological instrument that we have.
Once again, thank you very much for your time here tonight. I'm not going to say that all of Chile's economic success is due to Pinochet and his economic reform, because that would not be looking at the whole situation. But undoubtedly, a lot of the success that's made it one of the most powerful economic countries in South America is due to Pinochet's reforms that came at such a high cost. Now, my question is kind of how is that tension dealt with? How is that tension between kind of the success that there is economically and what the cost was to get the success, as in the Pinochet era?
Well, it seems to me that probably the big difference has to do with social policies. Because how we're going to have growth is one thing. But the next question is how you're going to distribute that growth in order to have a better society. In short, I know that many people think that there is a trickle down. If you have growth, automatically you will have a trickle down and everybody's going to be happy with the trickle down. Sometimes the trickle down takes so much time, you know. As the Pope, when visit Latin America, say, los pobres no pueden esperar. Poor people cannot keep waiting. and therefore, that is why it's so important to have public policies. What kind of public policies with regard to health? What kind of public policies to regard to education, to social housing, or whatever? To the new judiciary system. In other words, there can be a lot of agreement with regard to economic policies, but social policies at the very end are going to make the difference. And the question that a country growth is the only yardstick, I think is wrong. Because sometimes you have to offer to the people some dreams of where would you like to go. Now, the big problem is that elections are every 4, every 5, every 6 years. It's too little time if you want and you have an ambitious goal. But how can you explain a sense where the society is going? And this, I think, is very important, especially for those that are in a position of leadership with regard to their own people. Yeah.
Thank you again for coming. Gracias por venir. I just wanted to ask you, having inherited a country under dictatorship, how hard was it to gain the trust of the people after what Pinochet did in the country? How hard was it for you to have them trust their government once more?
Well, I think that at the beginning it was very easy, simply because you promised that it was possible to defeat Pinochet, and we defeated Pinochet. So we have the trust of the people, you know. At the beginning, nobody believed me. I mean, you arrive to a town. I remember only half of this room was, no more people than that. And we were in the middle of that meeting, and all the army get around us just to produce fear, you know. And I told them, don't worry, no, we are now a legal party according to Pinochet's constitution, so we are legal, you know, don't worry about that. But of course I was extremely worried what's going to happen. And they told me, and we are extremely worried after you leave, because after all, somebody knows you. And if something happened to you, in the world, somebody's going to know that. But we are going to remain here alone. You see, so at the end, it was possible, and we demonstrated it was possible to defeat. We can vote, very, very happy. And therefore, we elected a new president, no complaints. So you have the trust of the people. The question is, how are you going to be able to keep that? till what extent the next delivery is not to win the plebiscite. The next delivery probably, now you're running the country, okay. What about education? What about housing? What about, you see? And that part, again, the only way I would say is through participation. Because probably our way of handling things, because it was a dictatorship, was from up to bottom. And when we arrived to government, we were up to bottom. If you compare President Lula, the Workers' Party, they keep winning elections at the municipal level since 82, but more strongly since 86. And the seal of that municipal administration was participation from the people. And they introduced, for instance, the budget participation. That the city council say, look, here we have $100. Can we put this in education, health, or roads that are very bad? Well, let's make a definition on that. No, the three of them. No, excuse me, you don't understand. You cannot do the three of them. The 100 goes for one, for this. I mean, you explain in a very clear way. Now, if finally you make a decision, well, this kind of participation gives you a much more legitimacy of what you are doing than if you are not doing that. And therefore, the big challenge probably is, how are we going to make our democracy with institutions, because it's very easy to discuss at the level of Providence. Because I go to the city council and, okay, it's much more difficult at the level of the federal government. And how you do that. This is the kind of thing that I do believe it's in order to keep confidence of the people. Huh? And therefore, I do think sincerely that some kind of new institutions in order to regain legitimacy are going to be essential. The lady here has.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Hungarian, and as a Hungarian, my nation too experienced communist dictatorship. My nation too struggled with how do we explain Hungarians torturing and killing other Hungarians. And around the same time, in the late 1980s, we had a democratic revolution, but our country, Hungary, never did the soul searching. It never had the commission. It never published the names of Communist Party members. And I'm wondering if you think, Czechoslovakia, East Germany did, those people were purged, they were not allowed to run for public office for a number of years. And I'm wondering if you think there is a connection between the viability of the democratic process and your commission, and what did your country do with the people who weren't actively torturing, but who were enabling and abetting and making possible the human rights abuses to continue?
Well, I think that, thank you for your question, because it's very concrete and difficult to answer. In what sense? Because I can tell you, look, all those people that committed those crimes, quite a number of them, are now in jail. Nevertheless, what about the intellectual authors of that? Those that knew that on behalf of the system that they were implemented, somebody else was tortured. And it's a question very difficult. Let me give you an example. Many of those people that disappear in Chile disappear because they were thrown away to the ocean. Okay. I was president, and I say to the military say there was a commission trying to see where they were, and one day the commander-in-chief asked to see me and went to my house, my private house, And Mr. President, you want to know the truth? Yes, I want to know the truth. The truth is rather awkward. Why? Because many of those that disappear are in the ocean. I had said that in a report during Pinochet. If they are in the ocean, tell us. But now he was talking with the president of the country. And I remember that the only thing that I asked him was, what did you throw away in the ocean? Human beings or bodies? And the answer was bodies. Okay. Go back to your question. One lieutenant of the Air Force has an helicopter in charge of that. And in that helicopter, she is supposed to take General Mr. So-and-so from here to there. And the other lieutenant, the same as the other, in charge of the helicopter, he say, please, Lieutenant, would you take these elements that are going to be given to you and you will throw it away, drop in the ocean? It's impossible that that lieutenant didn't know what were those elements that he put in the ocean. And the other took the general and sent from this place to the other place. Okay. Finally, you go to a judge, and finally the judge will say, I wanted to know what are the officers on duty that day, and they got it today. How many helicopters, how many officers, etc., etc. And finally, he will discover that it was this lieutenant that was ordered to transfer the general from one place to the other, and the other lieutenant to drop the bodies. What do you do with the lieutenant that dropped the bodies? Because it's just chance, you know. It was not something that, and he will tell you, well, look, I was obeying orders. So he was responsible. He's part of the, he has to be, that's the kind of thing that is so difficult to, where you put the limit, you know. Nevertheless, to be very open, those that were practical, making torture, most of them are now in prison. But nevertheless, I have said several times, even today, many civilians that were backing Pinochet's government has never asked pardon to the country. And I think that it's impossible for them not to know what was going on. But it's not easy. And probably in the case of the Eastern European countries, so many people was part of the system, you know. Well, many of the leaders of today, those countries, used to be members of the youth of one of those communist parties, etc., etc. So it's a little bit difficult. Yeah. Yes.
Mr. President, thank you for being here. My question is in regards to a fellow South American country, Colombia. Colombia, I'm sorry?
Colombia?
Yeah.
Okay.
Colombia has been battling a war, civil war, for over 50 years now with rebel forces. And do you believe, as someone that effectively brought transitional justice to Chile, if the Colombian government can bring the rebels that have been killing civilians for the past 50 years to justice and come to an agreement with them without ceding too much power in the end?
Well, I think I have a tremendous, let me tell you this, I have a tremendous respect for what President Santos is doing. I think that they have been able to, first as the Minister of Defense of President Uribe, and then what's going on as the President, a very tough hand on the guerrillas. But at the same time, he has been open enough in order to tell them, look, why don't we try to make peace? And there is one thing, in order to make peace, that I will agree with you, that when that recover the land from the guerrillas, that land is going to be turned over the peasants. So that one of the major demands that you had as a revolutionary guerrillas about the land, well, the land that you have is going to be returned to them. And this, to some extent, I guess, has been an important element in the negotiations. Because with regard to any other demand of the FARC, of the guerrillas, I want to have a different capitalistic system, I want to have whatever it is, in terms of economic policy or social policy, the answer is always the same. Well, with peace, you are going to be participating in a democratic country, and when those brilliant ideas that you have are the majority in this country, you implement it. In the meantime, try to make, and I think this is, it seems to me that President Santos may succeed, in a sense that is quite realistic, the way that he's putting things to them. The most difficult part probably is going to be how you reinsert those people in Colombian society. If you have been in the guerrilla for 40 years, what's the only thing that you know how to do? Survive in the tropical forest. This is the only real thing that you know how to do. And therefore, how are you going to do later, you know? That part is very difficult. Nevertheless, there are some experience. But I think that President Santos may succeed in what he is attempting to do in the negotiations in La Habana. Yeah. But it's not easy. Thank you.
Thank you, President Lagos, for what has been a very stimulating and productive discussion. As we conclude, I'd like to invite up Esteban Rojas, representing the Organization of Latin American Students, to present a small gift on behalf of Providence College. So, So thank. Yeah, go ahead, open it up.
Oh, Providence College. Well, very well. Probably you know. Probably they knew that we was going back to Chile, and this is fall, and therefore winter is approaching. Thank you very much.
Let's join in thanking President Lagos.